Hey y'all, welcome to Social Studies with Miss Rogers World History Edition. Today we are covering not only our third and final Abrahamic religion, but also the last religion in our religion section of world history. This religion is Islam, and it's the youngest of all of the major religions in the whole world. Date-wise, students sometimes get a little bit confused with Islam because we relate the content all the way back to ancient times and Abraham. But Islam itself is not actually established until a time period known as the Middle Ages, which is an entirely different unit than ancient civilizations. However, Islam is still an Abrahamic religion, and its roots date all the way back to the ancient era, so that's why we learn about this religion in our Ancient Civilizations unit. So, let's get started. When we first started talking about Abrahamic religions, our story took place on what we now call the Arabian Peninsula. We had Mesopotamia, where Abraham was from, right over here. They left for an area called Canaan, or the Promised Land, right over here. And they even went to Egypt, which is where the handmaiden Hagar joined their party. Obviously, as time goes on, this will be the same area of Judea where we talked about Christianity. But remember, we are rewinding all the way back to Abraham. So where we're starting today, Christianity has not been established yet. Let's go back to our story from Judaism, as Abraham and his family are settled in the land of Canaan. Let's remember how he conceived a child with Hagar since his wife was barren, and the child was called Ishmael. According to Judaism, it said that God gave Abraham's wife Sarah a miracle child, who they called Isaac. Sarah became jealous of Hagar and Ishmael's presence, and she told Abraham to make them leave. It said that God promised that because Ishmael was the seed of Abraham, God would make sure he stayed safe. So Abraham did as his wife requested and sent Hagar and Ishmael away. According to the Quran, or the Islamic holy book, Abraham took them to a spot in the desert that we today call Mecca. As Abraham is about to leave, Hagar asks him, who are you entrusting our safety to? Abraham responds with, well, God, of course. And Hagar says something along the lines of, you know what, that's valid. As Hagar and Ishmael carry on, they eventually run out of water. Hagar frantically runs around this area of the desert, searching for water for her dehydrated and crying child, but she's extremely unlucky. When she returns to Ishmael, she finds him scratching on the ground, where all of a sudden water erupts, creating a giant spring for the area that would later be known as Zamzam. Fun fact, some versions of this story say that Hagar returned to Ishmael to find the angel Gabriel creating Zamzam. But regardless of whether Ishmael or Gabriel found the spring, Muslims today still regard this event as holy. Hagar running between hills in search of water is an action that's mimicked during the Hajj, or the Holy Pilgrimage. Zamzam water is also considered especially amazing. I have a friend who describes this water as just incredible. She says that when her friends travel for their Hajj, they'll bring back Zamzam water for their friends, and sometimes even local weddings will ship Zamzam water in as party favors. They say that the water is just different from regular water, and there's no real way to describe it other than that it's holy. Eventually, a tribe called the Jerem passes by and sees the water source. They are amazed that such a thing could exist in the middle of the desert. They asked Hagar, would you mind if we were allowed to settle along the spring just that we could have access to water for our people? Hagar agreed, and they coexisted by the spring for many years, teaching each other their ways of life. And as the years went on, their community would continue to grow into its own society. Now we see photos of modern-day Middle Eastern cities like Medina, Dubai, Mecca, and yeah, they look so nice. But the Arabian Peninsula without all of today's fancy technology can be really difficult to live in. The peninsula's climate is mostly desert, and for those of you who don't know this, it can be really hard to find food and water sources in the desert. Pause. I know we've gone over this already, but it doesn't matter because the number of students who ask me this each year just hurts my soul. No, just because an area is on the coast does not mean they have unlimited access to water. You cannot drink or farm with salt water. You just can't do it. The salt in the water will dehydrate you if you drink it, and will dehydrate the crops if you try to farm with it. The people of the Arabian Peninsula were originally called Bedouins. This name comes from the Arabic root for desert dweller. Each tribe of Bedouins was led by their own sheikh, who's chosen by the tribe's elders from one of the leading families. Many years ago, Bedouins were strictly nomadic tribes, though they've since ceased their nomadic lifestyle as settled civilizations became more possible, one example of this being when Zamzam becomes a steady water source. And this community would continue to grow as Ismā'īl gets older. It's said that after Hagar's death, Abraham returned to Mecca to check on his child. He approached his son's house and knocked on the door. Unfortunately, Ismā'īl was not there, but his wife was. Abraham asked to come in and immediately noticed how rude this woman was. She was not welcoming or generous, and Abraham didn't want to stay in her company any longer. He was like, yeah, I really need to leave, but can you give Ismā'īl a message for me? Can you tell him I really do not like the threshold of his door? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. When Ismā'īl came home, the wife relayed this message, and he instantly knew what the message meant, so he quickly divorced his wife. According to the Quran, Abraham visited Ismā'īl's house a second time, though once again, Ismā'īl was not home. Ismā'īl's new wife greeted Abraham at the door, and Abraham had a very different experience this visit. The new wife was very kind and generous. She immediately offered Abraham a place to sit, something to eat, anything he could need at the time. Abraham said to her, "Wow, I really wish I had more time to stay, but I do need to be going soon. Though, can you give my son a message for me? Tell him I really like the threshold of his door. Much improvement. Very impressed." When Ismā'īl heard this message from his father, he knew that this woman would be his wife for the rest of his days. Now, at this point in history, we still do not have the religion of Islam. These are just the foundations of the society where Islam will be born. In fact, in this society that Ismā'īl and Hagar helped create, there's not even just one religion. Ismā'īl and Hagar originally were Jewish because, Abraham and his family were the first Jews ever. Some of the other inhabitants of this community picked up Judaism, though a lot of them stuck with their native polytheistic religions, and it really varied in this area. Abraham did return again to assist Ismā'īl in the construction of the Kaaba. There are many versions of the construction of the Kaaba, and they all differ in fairly significant ways, though we are going to save all these different variations for world religions. These different versions, though, all have Abraham build or cleanse the Kaaba, and then either immediately after or at an unknown time later in the future, the Quran says that God calls Abraham to establish the Hajj, or pilgrimage. We're going to discuss exactly what the Hajj is in a little bit when we talk about the 5 pillars, but it said that Ismā'īl was then left at the Kaaba to oversee it and teach others about the Hajj. After many generations, into this world stepped a man named Muhammad. We're not going to do a normal story time type thing for Muhammad because in the Islamic culture, images of Muhammad are prohibited. The reason for this is they feel that worshipping images of Muhammad would encourage idol worship, so they don't allow any photos or drawings of him. Muhammad was born in Mecca to a merchant family, though he was orphaned at just 6 years old. He grew up to become a caravan manager and married a rich widow named Khadijah. Throughout his life, Muhammad noticed that there was a huge gap between the generosity of most of society and the greediness of the elite in Mecca. Deeply worried, he began to visit the hills and meditate in search of a solution to this problem. According to the Quran, during one of Muhammad's visits, he heard a voice, the voice of the angel Gabriel. It said that Gabriel was delivering revelations from God himself. Out of these revelations, which were eventually written down, came the Quran, or the Holy Book of Islam. The Quran contains the ethical guidelines and laws by which followers of Allah are to live. Fun fact, Allah is just the Arabic word for God. It literally is just saying the name God in a different language. Even though a lot of people hear the name Allah and assume that Muslims pray to a completely different deity than Jews or Christians, it's not true. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all worship the same God, and that's why they're called Abrahamic religions. They worship the same God that came to Abraham. It's believed that the angel Gabriel said to Muhammad, "Hey, repeat everything I just told you just to make sure you remember it all correctly." This is why Muslims believe that the Quran differs from the Torah in the Bible, which are acknowledgeably written by people. They believe that the angel Gabriel made Muhammad repeat his words verbatim, which would mean that to them the Quran is directly the words from God. Muhammad believed that God had already revealed himself in the two other Abrahamic religions. He believed that God revealed himself in Judaism through Moses, and he believed that God revealed himself in Christianity through Jesus. Muhammad then believed that he was now receiving the third and final revelation of God for the religion of Islam. This brings me to a little fact that I think is so important because so many students and even a lot of adults in our societies don't really understand this. Islam is the name of the religion and Muslim is the name of someone who follows the religion. Just as Jews follow Judaism, a Christian follows Christianity, a Buddhist follows Buddhism, a Hindu follows Hinduism, a Muslim follows Islam. Muhammad returned home after receiving these revelations and reflected on his experience. He told his wife and she was like, "Whoa, that is so awesome!" She encouraged him to follow the messages of Gabriel, and they together became the first Muslims. Many were surprised to hear Muhammad's claim to be a prophet, and the wealthy were not fond of his attack on the elite lifestyle. Muhammad preached his message for 3 whole years, and after this long period of time, he had gotten a grand total of 30 followers. In 622 AD, or year 1 in the Islamic calendar, Muhammad and his supporters left Mecca to escape persecution, and they moved north to Medina, or now as it's called, the City of the Prophet. This journey to Medina is known as the Hijrah. In Medina, Muhammad gathers much more support from both locals and Bedouins. In the year 630, Muhammad is going to return to Mecca with an army of 10,000 men. Muhammad had become very important, both religiously and politically, and when the city of Mecca surrendered, most of the inhabitants converted to Islam. Muhammad was then able to declare the Kaaba a sacred shrine of Islam. 2 years after his triumph at Mecca, and just as Islam began to spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula, Muhammad unfortunately passes away. There is major debate on who's supposed to take his place in society because remember, Muhammad is both an important religious leader and a political leader. This was a very heated disagreement which would eventually create 2 different sects of Islam, the Sunnis and the Shi'as. Shi'as believe that Muhammad's successor should come from his bloodline, and more specifically his descendants. They supported a man named Ali, who was not only a blood relative of Muhammad, but he grew up in the same house as Muhammad. Sunnis, on the other hand, believe that a successor should not have to be a blood relative, and they also thought that society should have a say in who would lead them. They supported a man named Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's father-in-law, and what started out as a verbal disagreement would eventually escalate into a super violent and deadly war. About 90% of modern-day Muslims consider themselves to be Sunni Muslims, and only about 10% consider themselves to be Shias. Now I say about because are there a number of Muslims who just classify themselves as Muslim and not of a part of a particular group? Absolutely, but they're a very small number. There really is so much more we could talk about in regards to Sunnis and Shias, but we are going to save that for a world religions class. Regardless of whether someone considers themselves to be Sunni or Shia or even neither, all Muslims hold the 5 pillars of Islam very dear. Jews and Christians hold the 10 Commandments as an ethical guide to life, but Muslims use the 5 pillars. The 5 pillars are seen as a gateway to Allah, and it's expected that you live your life accordingly. Now, before I start explaining what each of the 5 pillars are, I just want to say that I've been through multiple different sources, and the order of the 5 pillars has not been 100% consistent. So if the order that I give is different from what you've learned as a child, that's why. The first pillar, called Shahada, is the declaration of faith. It says that no one is worthy of worship other than God, and Muhammad was his final messenger or prophet. The second pillar, Salat, is the 5 daily prayers. Muslims are supposed to pray to God 5 times a day, at dawn, noon, afternoon, sunset, and in the late evening. While praying, Muslims are supposed to face Mecca. These prayers are required, though it's said that God will make an exception for special cases, such as if you're really sick. Salat can be compared to yoga in that prayer and feeling close to God gives Muslims the comfort and relief in the same way that yoga is supposed to relax your mind. The third pillar is zakat, or giving charity. Wealthy Muslims are expected to give a % of their salary to the poor or a charity. The fourth, Sawm, is fasting the month of Ramadan. During the month of Ramadan, Muslims are not supposed to eat, drink, or smoke cigarettes during daylight hours. Just imagine the kind of dedication and self-control required for this task, especially if you're fasting in the middle of a super hot desert. Ramadan is a holiday on the lunar calendar, so it appears to move around on our everyday calendar each year. Ramadan is a time of spiritual reflection, self-improvement, and worship. It's thought that the act of fasting will not only purify their hearts, but lead Muslims away from worldly pleasures and back towards Islamic teachings. They believe that Ramadan teaches self-discipline, self-control, sacrifice, and empathy. The fifth and final pillar is the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca that we talked about a little bit earlier. If they're financially able, Muslims are expected to try and make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their life. While on the Hajj, Muslims will trace the steps of Hagar from when she was searching for water just before Zamzam was discovered between Al-Safa and Al-Marwa. They will also visit the Kaaba, which translates to House of God. When visiting, Muslims must circle the Kaaba 7 times counterclockwise. During the Hajj, Muslims must both seek forgiveness at Mount Arafat and throw pebbles at the 3 pillars called Jamarat to honor Abraham. Though the 5 pillars is the original code of ethics for Islam, after Muhammad's death, Muslim scholars developed a law code known as Sharia law to help keep order in society. It provides believers with a set of practical laws to regulate their daily lives, and it's based on the scholars' interpretations of the Quran and the examples set by Muhammad in his life. Sharia law in itself is a very loaded topic, which I do really want to cover, but this again is something we are going to be saving for world religions. Since we've already talked about Ramadan, which is such an important holiday in Islam, I want to talk about something that I think is just as important. Islam is one of the most misunderstood religions in our nation, and a large part of that is due to the stigma that's been placed on the culture. Islam in all reality is meant to be a peaceful religion that focuses on education and knowledge, and it's truly unfortunate when a small percentage of people pervert the faith in order to drive their own political agendas. Just because that kind of behavior might be what the media likes to focus on, doesn't mean that's the kind of behavior all almost 2 million people a part of the faith condone. Just to be clear, the more the media freaks you out and makes you feel like you need an update from them, the more money they make. That really is their only goal, not to make you feel better about the world, but to rile you up about anything so you feel like you need to keep watching. So with that being said, I want to take a minute to showcase some famous Muslims in America that we love to prove that just because someone's a part of the Islamic faith does not make them scary or dangerous. There are so many things I want to go over for world religions in regards to Islam because I feel like the fear so many feel for this religion stems from a lack of understanding and knowledge, and my goal is to really help some people in that aspect. As far as world history goes, though, we are finished with our religion section, and we'll continue our ancient civilizations unit with ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So I'll see you guys then!